Salutations! I'm the Hextech artist and an avid Arcane fan, and seeing as I've already made a Jayce doll, he would not be complete without his Hextech hammer. I begin by sketching out his hammer based off the one in the show. This is mainly just to get the shapes and sizes that I need compared to the doll. I decided I was going to be using chopsticks to be the main pole of the hammer. I ended up having to combine two and cut them to size to fit the size that I needed, which isn't too sturdy and that'll come back to bite me later. I sketch out on the chopstick where the different attachments and accessories are going to be, and then I begin wrapping it in paper to build up the pieces. I layer different sizes of paper in different amounts and quantities to get the sizes and shapes that I need. I just use scrap paper from old homework that I used to have lying around. I go over the top piece that's going to attach the hammerhead with some more cardstock for detailing, and then I use thinner strips for extra details. I also make the handle out of more cardstock and a little touch of foam, and then I hot glue gun it to the side of the hammer pole. Once most of the pieces are made, I then go over the edges of them with clay and glue. This is to hide the seam of the paper where you can tell that it's just rolled up pieces of paper like those paper beads made from necklaces when you're a kid. I'm using epoxy sculpt clay, which is a two-part clay that cures on its own. That way it doesn't have to go in the oven. On the tail end of the hammer, it's made completely out of clay instead of just paper. I begin building up the size that I need and referencing the drawing, but I forgot that the drawing I did wasn't fully complete for the tail end, so I have to rework it later. Once the handle of the hammer has been mostly done for this stage, I switch over to sketching out on some parchment paper the designs that I need for the top of the head of the hammer. I cut out in cardstock all the layers of the shapes I need for the different parts. I stack different amounts of cardstocks to make it thicker and build up detail, and then compare it to size. For the top and bottom of the hammerhead, where it's going to be attaching onto the stick part, there's going to be a slot to insert it. And once I make the top and bottom, I just cut it out. Some of the pieces are just repeats of each other, so I don't resketch them, I just keep making more pieces of it. For the front face of the hammer, it's going to be the same on the back and the front of it, so I just make one copy of that as well. I double check all of my pieces to make sure they're still fully the size before I cut anything out. There's about 4 stacks of the pieces that go on top of the main frame of it to make it thicker. I just use cereal boxes. To make the main box of the head of the hammer, I just line them up to make sure everything fits correctly before hot glue gunning them together. The decorative piece on the front and back of the hammer is just a gear with an old earring piece that I hot glue gun to the front of it, and that goes right in the center. I line around the edges of a 3D piece of some more cardstock that stands directly up. And to keep the pole directly in place of where I want it in the bottom, I use a gear with a slot in the middle to hot glue gun that in place. Before anything gets fully closed up, I start painting the inside black before it becomes unreachable. Those trapezoids that we had in the beginning get glued together in a similar square shape, and then they'll get glue gunned into the inside sides of the head of the hammer. There's some gapping because the sizes didn't end up working out how I want, but I'll fix that in a minute. Then I just hot glue gun the pole directly into the slot with the gear we made earlier. This becomes really top heavy at this point. I added some more gears to the inside, that way the top slot doesn't look as empty. Now we're going to hot glue gun some more cardstock to the sides to close up this bad boy. I cut out some rectangles of cardboard, and then I cover the edges of that with some paper that I glued on it to hide the seams. And then I glue that to the sides of the hammer. This became a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. I add some more cardstock details on the face of the hammer, including overlapping that gear piece on the very front and back. For the clay end of the hammer, we're going to go over it with some raised cardstock details. Got a little bit messy because I had to hot glue gun it in place instead of using liquid glue. This is it finished in its cardstock phase. I really love this phase of crafting. So beautiful right before we paint it in full detail. I actually ended up painting it much darker than it needed to be originally. Jayce's hammer is a much more light gray color, almost like a really whitish silver, and I went way too dark at first. There's not a lot of very well lit shots of his hammer for when I started making this. There's a lot of contrast of gold and silver on it, so when I was painting this I was trying to go for the Arcane art style, so I didn't use actual metallic paint for the majority of it, trying to mimic that metallic style without actually using metallic paints. The Arcane art style is so beautiful and painterly, and I was really trying my best to make it look like that. Sections of the hammer get painted a very maroon red color, such as where the handle of the hammer is going to be. That's two different spots. I accidentally painted over them in yellow at first. I'm using erasers to hold up the tail end of the hammer. Very sophisticated setup of me, I know. I start painting on the blue details of where we can see the Hextech come into play here. Adding little touches of blue and the gray around it will help it look like light's reflecting out. At this point I started to paint on the highlights for it, but then realized, oh no, I made it way too dark, and started slowly lightening it more. It was quite the struggle. I kept repainting over it for a little while. The maroon red parts of the hammer I realized had this little interwoven detailing on it when I looked closely, so I just did that with some strips of paper wrapping around it. Then I just went back over it in the same red colors and then added some more shading of some light variations of the same red. More blues for the Hextech coming in on the tail end of the hammer. And now we're in the stage where we're mostly doing the highlights now. Just the extra little details that really make it look actually metallic. Painting where the light will get it to reflect and refract. You have to really pay attention to where you think the shadows would be for this, and where you think it would have the light reflect the most. It's especially on the edges. Arcane loves to do highlighted edges on any item. Never use full whites for these colors for the highlights. Always try and add a little bit of the color itself to the paint, that way it's still holding that color. Unless the item's gray, then you can use white, because that's basically the same thing. Truth be told, I'm actually not huge on making weapons for dolls, though I have made too many for my Jinx doll. Eventually I want to make my Vi dolls her hex gauntlets, so stay tuned for when I eventually do that. I also want to make fish bones for my Jinx doll. Don't have a set time or date for that. Right now I'm still just working on dolls. For the actual gemstones that go around the center of the face of the hammer, I used some little square rhinestones I ripped off a bead. I painted those deep blues, added some highlights, and then I just used some liquid glue to put those in a circle around it. I'm using Mod Podge to just glue them in a circle around the centerpiece on the front and back of the hammer. So here's the man of progress himself and his weapon of choice, the Zonchild Killer. It's a beautifully designed weapon. It's very beautiful. I know the original game makers are the ones that made the first hammer, but then got translated into the show, but it's beautiful to see how pieces of art and objects like this get translated over time. For those that are wondering how sturdy that chopstick holds up, not very well. In the middle of doing this photo shoot, the weapon ended up snapping in my hands. Yeah, pretty boy Jayce was not happy about that. Kinda is show accurate though, I think I'm gonna have to make his knee match. Thank you for sticking around, subscribe if you want, and I'll be working on more arcane and miniature things, so see you soon. Bye.